Yo, what's going on, Walten fans? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be talking about a theory I had specifically to do with Hotline, the newest episode of the Walten Files, with how it actually reveals some very key elements of Charles's scene in, obviously, episode 3 and also in episode 6. So without further ado, let's get straight into this. If you do enjoy, make sure to like it and subscribe down below. We're getting closer and closer to 7k. If you can help us hit that very, very soon, I'd be so appreciated. And it would be so Walten, this in my opinion. But without further ado, let's get straight into this theory about how, in my opinion, this episode reveals some very key elements of Charles' death scene in the Walten Files. So of course, we have to jump to Hotline. I think this episode is such a clear element of to do with Charles, because obviously we have David here. When he's on the phone here is a very, very key element, because when he's talking, or when we skip forward a little bit, he gets viewed by a specific type of spirit, and it kicks off instantly. Charles is here. Let's go full screen. Charles is here watching. Now, the very key elements of this is that this is also leading to the fact that Charles's spirit in Wonderland, obviously, can actually show itself like Bond does, which is very, very key elements, I think, because I think that obviously will go for the same as Rosemary and Susan, and possibly Ed and Molly as well. So that would be really, really cool. Also could kick off a new theory to do with Ed and Molly seeing Rosemary in Wonderland. Very tragic if that's a possibility. However, key element is that Charles, when he's here, is looking obviously at David. David doesn't see him, and Charles goes to the left. That's a very key element, because of course if we skip forward and Charles goes down that hall, there's obviously someone standing there, and of course it's Boozoo. The key element here is that Boozoo is almost haunted because he's singing. So are we supposed to think that Bond has some level of control to do with Boozoo, Banny, Shah, all the animatronics? Is that a possibility, to the fact that because Boozoo is very much like trying to creep him out there? Or there's another way of looking at this. Is this Charles trying to tell David, like, yeah, I'm a scary animatronic, get out of here? Literally, try get out. I don't know. There's two ways of looking at that. It's either, oh, it's, you know, scary for the sake of, ooh, he's gonna kill him, or it's scary for the sake of, yo, bro, get out of here. You know what I mean? There's very different ways of looking at it. Now, the key elements to this whole theory, in my opinion, is, of course, when David goes into his found footage. And this is very, very key, because obviously we look around K9 with this, the camcorder and whatever, but obviously, once again, Charles pops up on screen. Now, this is very, very key because of how Charles looks. As we can see, this is how Charles looks. Now, and I think it's very, very key to figure out what actually goes down with Charles, because I think it's a known fact that Charles's death scene in the series has been kept so secretive, but also very, very intriguing as well, and very obvious almost, because we see in episode 3 in Bunny Farm, he obviously has no lips. We have that photo, of course, of him, you know, with the 0714. And of course, here as well, it looks like he has no lips either, but he still has this mustache, which is interesting. However, we never get a full 100% confirmation of this is what happens to him. With Rosemary, we see that she gets ripped limb from limb. With Susan, we see her get her neck snapped. With Ed and Molly, we obviously know they died in the car crash. So when it comes to Charles, he's never really given an outright, yeah, this is what happened, this is how it happened. You know what I mean? It's never actually given straight to us, because in Bunny Farm, of course, we know what happens to Rose. Of course, we know that. But Charles is never, ever shown. So when it comes to this is kind of our first look at outright of an episode of what actually happens to Charles. I think Hotline is the closest thing we're going to get to how Charles actually dies in this series until episode 6. And that is a very key element, in my opinion, is how he looks in this episode. We see here, he obviously has 2 eyes, but later on in the video, we see this obviously face crawl down, which we'll get onto later. However, we see this. Now, are we supposed to think that Bond ripped his throat out? Is that just kind of like clothing? Is that kind of like a Wonderland scene like we got with Rosemary? Of Rosemary looking like Shah, but being Rosemary? Is this meant to be, you know, Charles kind of looking like Boozoo? That's kind of like his roughed up ringmaster outfit. Who knows? I'm leaning more towards on the side of this being actual, like, resulting in what happened to him. That's how I'm seeing this. And to me, when it comes to this, I think it's very, very key, because this either is a lot of flesh or it's clothing. Of course, I'm going to lead on with the theory of it being flesh. Now, the fact that this is what Bond does to him, we can see that there's no connection of skin from here up until basically kind of like the line of his chin here. But as you can see, his mouth is kind of like ripped open, like in episode 3 that we saw. We see that there's pretty much like there's wounds all the way down. So did Bond like rip his trachea and esophagus out maybe? I don't know, which could be a very key element. I mean, when it comes to episode 3 of Bunny Farm, with the actual scene of, the Charles scene, we do see him talk in just random blibbers of words. So we're going to go back and I will prove that right now. As we can see in this scene specifically, so the whole thing of Charles getting his trachea ripped out would obviously mean he can't talk, he can't do nothing. So what if this is to do with that? Because when Charles pops up in Bunny Farm, he speaks like this, which is really, really key in my opinion. I think it's actually a really cool theory. Obviously we have Showbear there, or Mr. Snow. That's how he talks, rather than giving actual information, which is very, very cool in my opinion. Like, he has no ability to talk to us, to Sophie. So, and that line. What Sophie says there is, this feels like the player is trying to tell the player something. He's trying to tell him what to do, but he can't. He cannot tell Sophie, get out. He can't tell him that. Likewise, with Hotline, of him being in the Boozoo suit playing the scary music is also his way of being able to communicate with saying, get out. He can't outright say it because he has no throat. He has no vocal cords. He has no throat. He can't speak. Likewise, in this scene, when he appears on screen, it goes silent and almost looks like he's trying to tell David something, but he can't. See? He's talking in that same, like, almost breath and gasping tone of, like, he can't speak. He can't talk to him. But in reality, he can't talk to him because of what Bond done to him. So does this confirm that Bond rips his throat out? And Bond rips all that, like, area here on his neck and also the bottom half of his lips, literally just limiting him to not being able to talk. That is such a key element, and we're not even into the last parts of this theory either with what happened to Charles. So we know Bunny Farm, he's obviously, his lips get removed. There we go, his lips get removed. In Hotline, if we combine what we know in this episode and in Bunny Farm, it now basically almost confirms that he can't talk anymore. Therefore, he probably got something to do with his throat. That looks like a massive wound, so therefore it possibly leads to a huge, huge indication that Bond ripped his throat out. And then, of course, we get the Bond jump scare scene. And then we get this, with especially, which is cool in my opinion, which then confirms another thing that happens to Charles. And that is, which will be shown in like 2 seconds. Charles tries to talk again. You can hear something's being told here. And we see Charles pop down. And if we can get as much as we can as possible, I'm going to go frame by frame to get as much possible look at this. We can see Charles with no eyeball. And again, there's his lip. So there we have Bond. Let's set the scene, right? Let's combine everything we know about Charles and his death scene as of this moment. Charles probably is working at Bond's Burgers late at night, obviously trying to set up for Lily's birthday party like the Bunny Farm game suggests. He then goes to the back room to get more supplies for Lily's birthday. What happens? Banny is sitting in the back room, because that's where Banny is when Susan starves. We saw that in Lacrimosa. Now, that image of Charles looking directly down and being shocked, I think that's him looking in the Banny suit and seeing Susan starving. Obviously, pretty much dead, right? So he sees Susan, begins to rush out the door like, yo, we gotta go. Bond finds him. We see there's a very clear image in the Season 1B trailer of Bond standing at the edge of the dining area. I think that's when Charles gets killed. Bond grabs him in the dining area, smashes his head against the table or whatnot, then pins him down, rips out his throat, rips his lips, and then goes for his eyes. Because we know that Bond has a habit of going for the eyes. We've seen it in Susan's death scene. We will probably see it in Rosemary's death scene as well. We saw that when he grabbed Susan, he immediately went at scratching for the eyes. We immediately saw that. So I personally think that Hotline basically confirms the Charles death scene right out. That he gets his throat ripped out, can't talk anymore. He's probably screaming a lot, so Bond, removes that ability with his throat, then rips his eye out, and obviously he dies in that sense. But yeah, I think that's what happens to him. I think the whole eyeball thing is it's very Bond, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's a very key element, and in my opinion, I don't see anything that could go against what I've just said, what happens to Charles in the end. But ultimately, I actually don't see any other outcome that could happen with Charles. He obviously gets his throat ripped out because he can't talk. The Bunny Farm game suggests that. The scene in Hotline suggests that. We obviously know in Bunny Farm he gets his lips removed. I think that Hotline confirms the Charles death scene literally in clear order for us to just piece together that puzzle, and ultimately that just reveals everything what actually happens to Charles, which is a gory, horrifying, disturbing thought to think about what actually happens to this dude. God only knows what's going to happen in episode 6 and how they're going to show that and show it to us, but I guarantee you what I've just said is exactly what happens. The teasers are there for us to piece together. The shocked look, the Bond standing in the dining area, the shot of Charles walking past the stage with Bond, Billy, and Shaw there. I think the lighting and the stage is basically set for us to see what actually happens to Charles, and I think that's exactly what I've just said. So thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you think of this theory in the comments below. I put a lot of work into this theory trying to back up everything I've said, so I'd really appreciate any support. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. I'd appreciate it so much. We're getting so close to 7K, and I just appreciate all the support recently. It's been absolutely insane. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll check you in the next one. Of course, stay safe and peace. First shot of this episode, Tammy picks this house.
Oh, what about that one?
Now, if you ask me, that is the, worst house you can pick. It has wallpaper on the outside.